Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Construction options. Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Building. Construction complete. Construction options. Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Building. Building.
Reporting.
Construction complete. Building. Unit ready. Building.
Awaiting affirmative.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Building. Training. Our base is under attack.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Orders. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Report. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Training.
Yes,
Unit
sir.
ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Very well. Reporting. Agreed. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Reporting. Agreed. Yes, sir. Very well. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Agreed. At once.
training. Unit ready.
Reporting. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Building.
Awaiting orders. Reporting. Affirmative. Awaiting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Waiting order. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Insufficient funds. Construction complete.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready.
Reporting. Comrade. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Construction
Agreed.
complete. Reconstruction options.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Reporting. At once.
Repairing.
Yes, sir. At once.
Unit repaired. Building.
Ready and waiting.
Repairing.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit repaired.
Acknowledged.
Repairing.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Waiting order.
Unit repaired.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Vehicle report. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Report. Acknowledged.
Insufficient funds. Building.
Vehicle report. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building. Construction complete. Reconstruction options. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Vehicle report. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Comrade, affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle report acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Waiting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Awaiting order. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Awaiting. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Vehicle acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building. Building.
Vehicle report acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting order. Very well. Yes, acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready. Insufficient funds.
Awaits affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting orders. Agreed. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Vehicle acknowledged. Yes, sir. Vehicle acknowledged. Acknowledged. Waiting acknowledged. Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Comrade, affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Preparing.
Comrade, acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Unit prepared.
Yes, affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Preparing.
Waiting order. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Unit prepared. Building. Preparing. On hold.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Comrade. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged.
prepared.
Acknowledged. Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Comrade. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Waiting order.
Building.
Wait affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Waiting affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Reporting.
Prepare.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Unit
acknowledge.
prepared.
Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Vehicle reporting.
Unit
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, acknowledge. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Comrade. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Awaiting affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Waiting affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Prepare.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Awaiting orders.
Construction complete.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Construction
Reporting.
options. Low power. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Unit
Yes, sir.
prepared.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Comrade. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Recording. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Waiting affirmative. Report. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged. Yes. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting for affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, affirmative. Ready? Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Building. Training. On hold. Cancel.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction
Waiting order.
complete.
Report affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready. Construction complete. Building. 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 Unit ready. Construction complete. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Yes,
ready.
sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Very well. Yes, sir. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Report.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting
Unit
order
lost.
at once. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Yes, sir.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Waiting.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Waiting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. 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 Waiting. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Yes,
lost.
sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes,
lost.
sir. Yes, sir. Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Reporting.
lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Reporting.
Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Yes, sir.
Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Acknowledge. Vehicle
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Comrade, acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. 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 Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Comrade.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Waiting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Reporting.
Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Echo reported.
Building. Mission accomplished.